Welcome, dear traveler, to Mystic Bedtime Stories. I'm your gentle guide through the veils of history, where ancient whispers still echo in the silence of night. Here, in this sacred space between waking and dreaming, we journey together to places where time moves differently, where the boundaries between myth and reality dissolve like morning mist. Tonight, we venture to one of the most mystical places ever known to humanity, a place where mortals once believed the gods themselves spoke through human lips, where the future was whispered through sacred vapors rising from the earth's very heart. This is not merely a story of ancient Greece, but a meditation on the eternal human desire to glimpse what lies beyond the veil of tomorrow. So settle yourself comfortably, dear listener. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders release their burden of the day. Close your eyes if you wish, and allow yourself to drift backward through the centuries, to a time when the world was younger and more mysterious, when divine voices echoed through marble halls, and the future hung in the balance of a single, cryptic phrase. Our story tonight carries you to the Oracle of Delphi, to witness the oracle's curse, those whispers from ancient Greece that shaped the destiny of kings and kingdoms. But more than that, it invites you to explore the profound mystery of how we, as humans, have always sought to understand our place in the grand tapestry of existence. Transition to main story, the mist of Parnassus. Let us begin our journey on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where the morning mist clings to ancient stones like the breath of sleeping gods. The year is lost to time, perhaps the 7th century before Christ, perhaps earlier still. The exact moment matters less than the feeling of this place, this sacred geography where earth meets sky in a communion of mystery. Picture, if you will, a landscape painted in shades of silver and sage. The Mediterranean sun has not yet burned away the night's gentle veil, and the air carries the scent of wild thyme and cypress, mingled with something else, something indefinable that makes pilgrims pause and lower their voices to whispers. You are walking along an ancient path, your footsteps joining the echoes of countless others who have made this same journey. Persian kings and Athenian philosophers, Spartan generals and humble farmers, all have climbed these winding slopes, drawn by the same irresistible pull toward the unknown. The path curves around a massive outcrop of limestone, and suddenly, there it is, the sacred precinct of Delphi, spread before you like a vision from a dream. But this is no ordinary dream. This is the place the ancients called the Omphalos, the navel of the world, where Zeus himself once released 2 eagles from opposite ends of the earth, and here, at this very spot, they met in their flight. The buildings seemed to grow from the rock itself, temples and treasuries, a theater carved into the hillside, and everywhere, the sense of presence. Not the presence of crowds or commerce, though both existed here in abundance during the great festivals. No, this is a different kind of presence, older and more profound. It is the presence of the unknown making itself known, of the invisible, world pressing against the visible like a curtain stirred by an unfelt wind. As you approach the heart of the sanctuary, you begin to hear it, or perhaps you only imagine you hear it. A sound like distant voices, like the whisper of wind through stone, like the soft susurrus of secrets being shared. It seems to rise from the very earth, from that sacred chasm where vapors emerge from the deep places of the world. This is where she sits, the Pythia, the voice of Apollo, the mortal woman who becomes the mouthpiece of the divine. In a few hours, when the sun reaches its zenith and the pilgrims gather with their questions and their offerings, she will take her place upon the sacred tripod. She will breathe the sweet vapors that rise from the earth's secret heart, and she will speak words that will echo through history, words that will topple empires and crown kings, words that will be remembered and interpreted and misunderstood for centuries to come. But for now, in this gentle hour between night and day, There is only the mist and the stone and the eternal mystery of human longing. The oracle's curse has not yet been spoken, though it hangs in the air like a promise or a threat. The whispers from ancient Greece are gathering strength, preparing to be heard by ears that may not be ready to understand their true meaning. Here, in this place where the ancient world believed the gods walked among mortals, where the future was currency and prophecy was power, we begin to understand something profound about the nature of human hope and human hubris. We begin to see how the very gift of foresight can become a curse, how the desire to know tomorrow can blind us to the wisdom of today. The mist is lifting now, slowly, reluctantly, revealing more of the sacred landscape. Delphi awakens to another day of pilgrims and priests, of questions asked and answers given, of destinies shaped by words spoken in divine madness. But the true mystery remains untouched by the morning light, as deep and unfathomable as ever. And so we pause here, you and I, on the threshold of this ancient story. We stand where countless seekers have stood before us, feeling the weight of unanswered questions and the promise of revelations yet to come. The oracle's curse awaits, patient as stone, inevitable as time itself. In the gentle silence that follows, we prepare to witness the unfolding of one of humanity's most enduring mysteries, the story of how the divine speaks to the mortal, how the future whispers to the present, and how the greatest gift can become the heaviest burden of all. The whispers from ancient Greece are about to begin. There is a place on this earth, dear listener, where the very stones seem to hold their breath, where the landscape itself whispers of mysteries older than memory. To understand the oracle's curse, we must first understand the sacred geography that gave birth to it, the remarkable sanctuary of Delphi, perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus like a jewel set in silver stone. Close your eyes and imagine, if you will, a world where the boundaries between the mortal and divine were as thin as morning mist. In this ancient landscape, every hill had its story, every spring its guardian spirit, every grove its resident god. But among all the sacred places of the ancient world, none commanded such reverence, such awe, such profound respect as Delphi. Greeks themselves told a story about how this place came to be recognized as the center of the world. Zeus, the As, king of the gods, sought to determine the exact middle point of the earth. From opposite ends of the world, he released two eagles, magnificent birds with wings that could span the heavens. These divine messengers flew toward each other across continents and oceans, their flight paths drawing invisible lines across the face of the earth. Where they met, there Zeus placed a sacred stone, the omphalos, marking the spot as the very navel of the world. This stone, carved with an intricate net-like pattern, became one of the most revered objects in all of ancient Greece. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles just to touch its surface, believing that in that moment of contact, they stood at the very center of existence itself. But the sanctity of Delphi predated even this divine measurement. Archaeological evidence suggests that people have been drawn to this place for over 3,000 years, sensing something in the landscape that called to the deepest parts of the human soul. Perhaps it was the way the morning light struck the limestone cliffs, creating shadows that seemed to move with purpose. Perhaps it was the sound of the wind through the sacred laurel groves, carrying whispers that seemed almost like words. The physical setting of Delphi is itself a testament to the ancient understanding of sacred space. The sanctuary sits on a natural terrace, carved into the southern slope of Mount Parnassus, at an elevation that places it between the earthly realm below and the heavenly realm above. From this vantage point, visitors could look out over the valley of Plestos, where olive groves stretched to the horizon like a silver-green sea. Behind the sanctuary, the cliffs of Parnassus rose dramatically, their faces carved and sculpted. By millennia of wind and weather into forms that seemed almost architectural, as if the mountain itself had been designed as a backdrop for divine drama. These cliffs, known to the ancients as the Phaedriades or Shining Ones, caught and reflected the light in ways that made them seem almost alive, almost conscious. It was here, in a natural fissure in the earth, that the most sacred element of Delphi was discovered. Deep beneath the temple that would eventually be built to honor Apollo, a chasm opened into the very heart of the mountain. From this opening, mysterious vapors would rise, carrying with them an otherworldly fragrance that seemed to open the mind to possibilities beyond ordinary perception. The discovery of this sacred chasm was itself the subject of legend. Some stories tell of a goatherd who noticed his animals behaving strangely when they wandered near a certain spot on the mountainside. The goats would begin to leap and dance in ways that seemed almost ecstatic, as if they were responding to some invisible music. When the shepherd investigated, he too was affected by the mysterious vapors, finding himself filled with visions and prophetic utterances. Word of this remarkable phenomenon spread throughout the ancient world. Pilgrims began to arrive, drawn by stories of the place where the earth itself seemed to speak. They came not just from Greece, but from across the Mediterranean world, from Egypt and Libya, from the Greek colonies in Italy and Sicily, from the emerging cities of Asia Minor, and eventually from the great empires of Persia and Rome. The journey to Delphi was itself a form of pilgrimage, a gradual ascent both physical and spiritual. Travelers would leave behind the familiar world of their daily lives, climbing higher and higher into the mountains, each step taking them further from the ordinary and closer to the sacred. The path wound through landscapes that seemed increasingly otherworldly, past springs that were said to have healing properties, through groves where the trees themselves were considered sacred. As pilgrims approached the sanctuary, they would begin to encounter the first signs of the elaborate complex that had grown up around the sacred chasm. Stone markers lined the path, inscribed with dedications and prayers in a dozen different languages. These stela, as they were called, created a kind of written landscape, a library of human hopes and fears carved in stone. The sanctuary itself was laid out with careful attention to the natural topography of the mountainside, rather than imposing a rigid geometric plan on the landscape. The architects of Delphi worked with the contours of the earth, creating a complex that seemed to grow organically from the rock itself. The sacred way, the processional path that led to the temple of Apollo, wound upward in a series of gentle switchbacks, allowing visitors to approach the most sacred spaces gradually, with reverence and contemplation. Along this sacred way, the various Greek city-states built treasuries, small temple-like structures, designed to house their most precious offerings to the god. These buildings, each reflecting the architectural style of its builders, created a kind of permanent exhibition of Greek art and culture. The treasury of the Athenians, with its perfect proportions and exquisite marble sculpture, stood near. The treasury of the Siphonians, famous for its elaborate frieze depicting the battle between the gods and the giants. But it was the temple of Apollo itself that dominated the sanctuary, both physically and spiritually. Built and rebuilt several times over the centuries, the temple that pilgrims would have seen in the classical period was a masterpiece of Doric architecture, its columns rising from the mountain terrace like a forest of carved stone. The temple was designed not just as a building, but as a kind of spiritual instrument, its proportions and placement calculated to create the perfect setting for divine revelation. Within this temple, in the innermost sanctuary known as the Adyton, the sacred chasm opened into the depths of the earth. Here, directly over the source of the prophetic vapors, the famous tripod was placed, that bronze seat upon which the Pythia would sit to receive the words of Apollo. The entire complex was designed to focus attention on this single point, this place where the divine voice would emerge from the depths of the earth to speak to the world above. The influence of Delphi extended far beyond its physical boundaries. The oracle's pronouncements could determine the outcomes of wars, the founding of colonies, the rise and fall of dynasties. When the Persian Empire reached the height of its power, its kings still sought the counsel of the Oracle at Delphi. When Rome began its rise to dominance, its leaders too made the pilgrimage to this sacred place. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Delphi was not its political influence, but its role as a center of wisdom and learning. The famous maxim, "Know thyself," was inscribed above the entrance to Apollo's temple, serving as a reminder that the greatest prophecy was not knowledge of the future, but understanding of the self. Another inscription read, "Nothing in excess," a call for moderation and balance that would become central to Greek philosophical thought, as the sun moves across the sky above the sacred precinct, casting ever-changing shadows on the ancient stones. We begin to understand why this place captured the imagination of the ancient world. Delphi was more than a religious center. It was a place where the fundamental questions of human existence were asked, and, in some mysterious way, answered. It was a place where the impossible became possible, where the future whispered its secrets to those brave enough to listen. And yet, even as we marvel at the grandeur and mystery of this sacred place, we must remember that every gift comes with a price. The oracle's wisdom was real, but it was wisdom of a particular kind, cryptic, ambiguous, and often cruel in its ultimate clarity. The center of the world was also the place where humanity would learn, again and again, that some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, and that the future, once glimpsed, can never be unseen. The stage is set, dear listener, for the drama that will unfold in this sacred place. The stones of Delphi have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the hope and despair of countless pilgrims, the ecstasy and agony of divine revelation. In the gentle silence that follows, we prepare to meet the remarkable woman who would serve as the voice of the god and to understand the true nature of the oracle's curse. And now, dear listener, we must speak of her, the woman who became more than mortal, yet remained achingly human. The Pythia, whose name echoes through the corridors of time like a prayer, half remembered, half forgotten. She is the heart of our story, the living bridge between the world of flesh and the realm of the divine. Picture her as she might have been on any sacred day, not the wild-haired, frothing oracle of Hollywood imagination, but something far more profound and mysterious. She might have been a young woman from the mountains surrounding Delphi, chosen not for her beauty or her birth, but for something indefinable that marked her as suitable to be the voice of Apollo. Or perhaps she was older, a widow who had known the full weight of mortal life and was ready to transcend it. The selection of the Pythia was itself a mystery, wrapped in ritual. The priests of Apollo would watch for signs, for that subtle quality. That marked a woman as capable of receiving the god's voice. She had to be pure, they said, though what this meant in practice was often debated. Some scholars believed she had to be a virgin, others that she must be past the age of childbearing. But purity, in the context of ancient Greece, meant something deeper than physical state. It meant a clarity of spirit, an openness to the divine that could not be manufactured or faked. Once chosen, the Pythia would undergo a transformation that was both gradual and profound. She would leave behind her former life, her former name, her former identity. She would become, in the most literal sense, the property of the god, his earthly vessel, his living temple. The woman she had been would not disappear entirely, but would become secondary to her sacred function. The ritual of prophecy itself was carefully orchestrated, timed to coincide with the 7th day of each month during the warmer seasons. Apollo, the god of light and prophecy, was said to depart. Delphi during the winter months, traveling to the land of the Hyperboreans, that mystical realm beyond the north wind. In his absence, Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, was said to hold sway over the sacred precinct. But when Apollo returned with the spring, the oracle would resume her sacred duties. On the appointed day, the Pythia would begin her preparation long before dawn. She would purify herself in the sacred Castilian spring, whose waters were said to have the power to cleanse both body and soul. The spring still flows today, dear listener, emerging from the rocks of Mount Parnassus as it has for millennia, carrying within its crystalline depths the memory of countless ritual ablutions. After her purification, the Pythia would enter the inner sanctum of Apollo's temple, descending into the Adyton, the sacred chamber where no ordinary mortal was permitted to tread. Here, in the heart of the temple, stood the sacred tripod, a bronze seat with 3 legs, positioned directly over the chasm from which the prophetic vapors rose. The tripod itself was a marvel of ancient craftsmanship, its 3 legs representing the 3 realms of existence: earth, sea, and sky. Upon this seat, the Pythia would position herself, breathing in the mysterious vapors that emerged from the depths of the earth. Modern science has suggested these vapors might have been ethylene gas, produced by geological processes deep beneath the temple, but such explanations, while intellectually satisfying, cannot fully capture the profound spiritual transformation that the ancients believed occurred in that sacred space dot as the vapors filled her lungs. The Pythia would begin to change. Witnesses described a woman entering a state that transcended ordinary consciousness, not the violent possession of popular imagination, but something more subtle and profound. Her breathing would alter, becoming deeper, more rhythmic. Her voice would change, taking on qualities that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her mortal throat. The questions brought to the oracle were as varied as the human condition itself. Kings would ask about the outcomes of wars, merchants about the success of ventures, parents about the fates of their children. But the oracle's responses were rarely straightforward. The god, it seemed, preferred to speak in riddles, in metaphors, in language that required interpretation. This was where the priests of Apollo played their crucial role. They would listen to the Pythia's utterances, often delivered in a stream of consciousness that seemed to flow directly from the divine source. These words, sometimes coherent, sometimes fragmented, always charged with meaning, would be recorded, interpreted, and shaped into the formal prophecies that would be delivered to the questioners. The process was not without its controversies. Critics, even in ancient times, suggested that the priests might be manipulating the oracle's words to serve political purposes. The Temple of Apollo was, after all, one of the wealthiest institutions in the ancient world, supported by offerings from grateful clients and tribute from city-states seeking divine favor. But such cynical interpretations miss the deeper truth of what occurred in that sacred space. For the Pythia herself, the experience of prophecy was both a blessing and a burden. Ancient sources speak of the physical and emotional toll of serving as the god's mouthpiece. Some Pythia served for decades, growing old in the service of Apollo, their lives consumed by their sacred function. Others burned out quickly, unable to sustain the intensity of divine communion. There are accounts of Pythias who tried to resist the god's call, who found the burden of prophecy too heavy to bear. But Apollo, it was said, was not a god who accepted refusal easily. The divine voice would find its way through, whether the mortal vessel was willing or not. This was perhaps the first hint of the curse that would eventually become associated with the oracle, the understanding that divine gifts often come with a price that mortals are not prepared to pay. Yet despite the challenges, there was also a profound dignity in the Pythia's role. She was, in many ways, the most powerful person in the ancient world, her words capable of launching 1,000 ships or keeping them safely in harbor. Kings and peasants alike approached her with equal reverence, understanding that, in her presence, they stood before something greater than themselves. A physical presence of the Pythia, during prophecy, was said to be transformed. Witnesses described a woman who seemed to glow from within, whose ordinary features became luminous with divine presence. Her words, when they came, carried a weight that went beyond their literal meaning. They resonated in the minds of those who heard them, taking on new meanings and implications as time passed. This transformative quality of prophetic speech was perhaps the most mysterious aspect of the oracle's function. The same words could mean different things to different people, or to the same person at different times. A prophecy given to a king might seem to promise victory, only to reveal its true meaning in the moment of defeat. This ambiguity was not a flaw in the system, but its very essence. The understanding that truth, especially divine truth, is not always what it appears to be. As the sun reaches its zenith over the sacred precinct, the Pythia completes her sacred duty. The vapors begin to dissipate, the divine presence withdraws, and the woman, who is briefly more than mortal, returns to her earthly form. But the echoes of her words continue to resonate, carrying within them the seeds of destinies yet to be. Fulfilled. In the gentle stillness that follows, we begin to understand the true nature of the oracle's curse. It is not merely that the future is revealed, but that it is revealed in a form that ensures it will be misunderstood, misinterpreted, and ultimately fulfilled in ways that no one could have predicted. The very act of seeking to know tomorrow ensures that today will never be the same. The woman of the God has spoken, and the ancient world will never be quite the same again. And so they came, dear listener, from every corner of the ancient world, drawn by needs as varied as the human heart itself. Kings bearing golden crowns and shepherds clutching clay tokens, merchants with silver in their purses, and mothers with prayers upon their lips. All of them united by that most fundamental of human desires, the need to know what tomorrow might bring. The pilgrimage to Delphi was never undertaken lightly. It required not just physical endurance, but spiritual preparation, financial sacrifice, and above all, the courage to face answers that might not be what the questioner wished to hear. For the Oracle of Apollo was not known for her gentle reassurances or comfortable predictions. She was known for truth, and truth, as every seeker soon learned, was often a double-edged sword. Consider, if you will, the journey of a typical pilgrim in the height of Delphi's power. Perhaps a merchant from the bustling port of Corinth, his ships laden with goods from across the Mediterranean, but his heart heavy with uncertainty about a trading venture that could make or break his fortune. He would have spent weeks preparing for the journey, not just gathering the required offerings and fees, but purifying himself through ritual baths, fasting, and prayer. The cost of consulting the oracle was substantial, designed to ensure that only serious inquiries reached the sacred tripod. The basic fee, called the pelanos, was equivalent to several months' wages for a common laborer. But this was just the beginning. Pilgrims were expected to bring additional offerings, animals for sacrifice, precious objects for the temple treasury, tokens of respect and devotion that would demonstrate the sincerity of their request. The wealthy could afford to be generous. Persian satraps arrived with caravans of gifts, their retinues stretching for miles along the sacred way. Egyptian pharaohs sent elaborate sculptures and tons of gold. But the oracle was not merely the privilege of the rich. The temple provided special days when common people could consult the Pythia for reduced fees, understanding that divine wisdom should not be the exclusive province of the powerful. The process of consultation was itself a carefully orchestrated ritual. Pilgrims would arrive at Delphi and present themselves to the priests, who would examine their offerings and determine the order of consultation. Precedence was given to official delegations from city-states, then to private individuals, based on the value of their offerings and the urgency of their need. But before any question could be posed to the oracle, the gods themselves had to give their consent. On the appointed day, the priests would perform a preliminary divination, sprinkling cold water on a goat selected for sacrifice. If the animal shivered in the prescribed manner, it was taken as a sign that Apollo was present and willing to speak. If the goat remained still, the consultation would be postponed, sometimes for months. This preliminary test was more than mere ritual. It served as a filter, ensuring that only those with genuine need and proper preparation would reach the oracle. Many pilgrims waited weeks or even months for the sign to be favorable, living in the guest houses that surrounded the sanctuary, their anticipation building with each passing day. The questions brought to the oracle reflected the full spectrum of human concern. Affairs of state loomed large. Should Athens go to war with Sparta? Should Corinth establish a colony in Sicily? Should Thebes ally itself with the Persians? But personal matters were equally pressing. A childless couple might ask whether they would ever have children. A young man might inquire about his prospects for marriage. A farmer might seek guidance about when to plant his crops. The phrasing of questions was crucial, for the oracle was famous for her literal interpretations. A poorly worded question could lead to an answer that was technically correct, but practically useless. The priests who served as intermediaries between the questioners and the Pythia were skilled in the art of formulating inquiries that would yield meaningful responses. But even they could not guarantee that the answer would be what the questioner hoped to hear. The ritual of consultation itself was shrouded in mystery. The questioner would not be permitted to enter the inner sanctum where the Pythia sat upon her tripod. Instead, they would wait in the outer chamber of the temple, their question carried to the oracle by the priests. The sounds that emerged from the Adyton were often unsettling, not the clear, articulate speech of normal conversation, but something more primal, more otherworldly. Ancient sources describe the oracle's voice as sometimes barely human, rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. The priests would listen intently, recording the Pythia's utterances, then retreat to consider their meaning. The process of interpretation could take hours or even days, as the sacred words were examined, analyzed, and shaped into the formal response that would be delivered to the questioner. The responses themselves were legendary for their ambiguity. The oracle spoke in riddles, metaphors, and paradoxes that required careful interpretation. A king seeking victory in battle might be told that a great army will be destroyed, but whether it would be his own or his enemies remained tantalizingly unclear. A merchant asking about a trading venture might be advised to beware of the wine-dark sea when the moon is dark, leaving him to puzzle over whether this referred to a specific time, place, or condition. This ambiguity was not a flaw in the system, but its very essence. The oracle understood that the future was not fixed, but fluid, shaped by the choices and actions of those who sought to know it. Her prophecies were not predictions, but possibilities, warnings about the consequences of particular paths, invitations to consider alternatives that might not have occurred to the questioner. The psychological effect of consulting the oracle was profound. Many pilgrims reported that the experience changed them, regardless of the specific content of the prophecy they received. There was something about standing in that sacred space, about formulating their deepest concerns into words, about submitting themselves to divine judgment that brought clarity to their thinking and resolution to their uncertainty. But the oracle's influence extended far beyond individual guidance. Her pronouncements shaped the course of history, determining the outcomes of wars, the founding of cities, the rise and fall of dynasties. When the Greek cities faced the Persian invasion, it was the oracle who advised the Athenians to trust in their wooden walls, a cryptic phrase that some interpreted as the city's ancient fortifications, but which proved to refer to their naval fleet. The oracle's role in Greek colonization was particularly significant. No colony could be established without her approval, and her guidance determined not just whether a venture would succeed, but where it should be located, who should lead it, and what gods should be honored in the new settlement. The Greek cities that dotted the Mediterranean coast from Spain to the Black Sea all traced their origins, in some sense, to pronouncements made by the Pythia in her sacred chamber. Yet for all the reverence accorded to the oracle, there were always those who questioned her authority, who wondered whether her pronouncements were truly divine, or merely the clever manipulations of ambitious priests. The historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, recorded numerous instances where the oracle's prophecies proved to be accurate, but he also noted cases where they seemed to serve the political interests of particular city-states or individuals. The oracle's responses to foreign rulers were particularly scrutinized. When the fabulously wealthy King Croesus of Lydia consulted the oracle about his planned war against the Persian Empire, her response would become one of the most famous examples of prophetic ambiguity in all of ancient literature. But that story deserves its own telling, for it illustrates perfectly the double-edged nature of divine knowledge and the terrible price of misunderstanding the gods' intentions. As the sun sets over the sacred precinct, casting long shadows across the ancient stones, we can almost hear the echoes of all those voices, all those questions, all those hopes and fears that were brought to this place across the centuries. The seekers and the tested, the believers and the skeptics, all of them united in their desire to lift the veil that separates the present from the future. But desire, as the oracle well knew, was not the same as wisdom. The ability to see tomorrow was not the same as the ability to understand what should be done with that knowledge. And therein lay the beginning of the curse that would eventually consume not just individual questioners, but the oracle herself. The questions had been asked, the rituals performed, the offerings made. Now came the moment of truth, when divine wisdom would reveal its true nature, and the seekers would learn whether their pilgrimage to the center of the world had been a blessing or a curse. There comes a moment in every great story, dear listener, when the eternal themes of human nature crystallize into a single, perfect example. For the Oracle of Delphi, that moment arrived with the coming of Croesus, king of Lydia, whose name has echoed through history as a symbol of both immense wealth and profound folly. His story is not merely about one man's encounter with prophecy, but about the dangerous dance between divine knowledge and human interpretation, between what the gods reveal and what mortals choose to hear. Picture, if you will, the kingdom of Lydia in the middle of the 6th century before Christ. Located in what is now western Turkey, it was a land blessed by geography and enriched by trade. The Lydians were credited with inventing coined money, those small discs of electrum that would revolutionize commerce throughout the ancient world. Their kingdom sat astride the great trade routes between east and west, and their merchants grew fat on the profits of exchange. But it was their king, Croesus, who became the embodiment of mortal wealth. His treasury was legendary throughout the known world, filled with gold from the river Pactolus, silver from the mines of Anatolia, and precious goods from every corner of the earth. When people spoke of ultimate riches, they said someone was rich as Croesus. Yet for all his material abundance, Croesus was a man haunted by questions about the future. The king's fascination with oracles was well known. He had consulted seers and prophets throughout his realm and beyond, but none commanded the respect and fear that was accorded to the Oracle of Delphi. Before making any major decision, Croesus decided to test the various oracles of the ancient world to determine which one truly possessed the gift of divine sight. The test he devised was elegant in its simplicity. He sent messengers to 7 different oracles, including the one at Delphi, with instructions to ask the same question on the same day. What is King Croesus doing at this very moment? The king had planned to spend that day engaged in an activity so unusual and specific that no human intelligence could guess it. On the appointed day, Croesus took a lamb and a tortoise and boiled them together in a bronze cauldron with a bronze lid. It was an act so bizarre, so unprecedented, that surely only divine knowledge could penetrate its mystery. When the messengers returned with the responses from the various oracles, only one had answered correctly. The Pythia at Delphi had spoken these words: "I know the number of the sand and the measure of the sea. I understand the mute and hear the voiceless. The smell has come to me of a hard-shelled tortoise, boiled in bronze with lamb's flesh. Bronze is laid beneath it, and bronze covers it above." The accuracy of this response filled Croesus with a mixture of awe and confidence. Here was an oracle that truly possessed divine knowledge, that could see across vast distances and penetrate the most carefully guarded secrets. If the Pythia could know his private actions, surely she could reveal the secrets of the future that so concerned him. Croesus immediately began preparing lavish offerings for Apollo's temple. He sent golden statues, silver vessels, and precious stones in quantities that staggered even the priests of Delphi, who were accustomed to royal generosity. The king's offerings were so magnificent that they were displayed in the temple for centuries afterward, becoming tourist attractions in their own right. But Croesus had not made this investment merely to display his wealth. He had a specific question, one that would determine the fate of his kingdom and potentially reshape the balance of power in the ancient world. The Persian Empire, under its ambitious king Cyrus, was expanding rapidly westward. It was only a matter of time before Persian ambitions collided with Lydian interests. Croesus needed to know whether he should strike first or wait for the Persians to come to him. The question he posed to the oracle was carefully crafted. If I cross the river Halys and attack the Persians, what will be the result? The Halys River formed the boundary between the Lydian and Persian spheres of influence. To cross it with an army would be an act of war, but Croesus was prepared to take that risk if the gods favored his cause. The oracle's response came back with the characteristic ambiguity that had made her famous throughout the ancient world. If you cross the Halys, you will destroy a great empire. The words seemed clear enough, and Croesus interpreted them as a divine promise of victory. After all, if he attacked the Persians, whose empire would be destroyed but theirs? Emboldened by what he believed to be a divine guarantee of success, Croesus sought additional confirmation. He asked whether his reign would be long and prosperous. The oracle responded with another cryptic utterance. When a mule becomes king of the Persians, then tender-footed Lydian flee beside the pebbled. Hermes, do not stay, and do not be ashamed, be a coward. This second prophecy seemed even more reassuring than the first. A mule, being a sterile hybrid, could never become king of anything. The oracle seemed to be saying that Croesus would rule until an impossible event occurred, which was another way of saying he would rule forever. Filled with confidence, Croesus began his preparations for war. He formed alliances with the most powerful Greek city-states, including Sparta and Athens. He hired mercenaries from across the Mediterranean. He gathered the largest army that Lydia had ever fielded, confident that he was marching to victory under divine protection. The war began promisingly enough. Croesus crossed the Halys River and engaged the Persian forces in a series of battles that, while not decisive, seemed to favor the Lydians. But as winter approached, Croesus made a fatal error in judgment. Believing that the campaigning season was over and that both armies would retire to winter quarters, he dismissed his allied forces and returned to his capital at Sardis. Cyrus, however, had no intention of observing the conventional rules of warfare. Instead of retiring for the winter, he pressed his attack, following Croesus back to Sardis and laying siege to the city. The Lydian army, reduced and unprepared for a winter campaign, found itself trapped within the walls of the capital. The siege of Sardis lasted only 14 days. Through a combination of tactical brilliance and sheer audacity, the Persians found a way to scale the supposedly impregnable walls of the citadel. Croesus was captured, his kingdom conquered, his fabulous wealth added to the Persian treasury, as Croesus stood before his captor, awaiting execution. The full meaning of the oracle's words became devastatingly clear. A great empire had indeed been destroyed by his crossing of the Halys, but it was his own empire, not the Persian one. The prophecy had been literally accurate, but his interpretation had been completely wrong. The second prophecy proved equally accurate in its cruel precision. Cyrus, as Croesus learned too late, was of mixed parentage. His father was Persian, but his mother was Median. In Persian custom, this made him a mule, a ruler of hybrid bloodline. The impossible event that was supposed to signal Croesus's doom had already occurred, but the king had been too blind to see it. Legend tells us that as Croesus was about to be burned alive, he called out the name of Solon, the wise Athenian lawgiver who had once visited his court. When asked to explain, Croesus related Solon's famous maxim, "Call no man happy until he is dead." Cyrus, moved by this display of wisdom in the face of death, spared Croesus's life and made him a counselor. But the real tragedy of Croesus was not his defeat or his loss of wealth. It was his discovery that divine knowledge, no matter how accurate, was worthless without the wisdom to understand it. The oracle had told him the truth, but it was truth in a form that guaranteed his misunderstanding. She had answered his questions with perfect precision, but her answers had led him to destruction. This was the beginning of what would come to be known as the oracle's curse. Not that her prophecies were false, but that they were true in ways that human understanding could not encompass. The very act of seeking divine knowledge seemed to ensure that it would be misinterpreted, that the future would unfold in ways that mocked human attempts to control it. Croesus had come to Delphi as the richest man in the world, confident in his ability to purchase divine favor. He left as a broken king, his wealth scattered, his kingdom destroyed, his faith in prophecy forever shattered. Yet in his defeat, he had learned something more valuable than all his former riches, the understanding that wisdom and wealth were not the same thing, and that the gods' gifts often came wrapped in packages that looked like curses. The story of Croesus became a cautionary tale told throughout the ancient world, a reminder that divine knowledge was not a commodity to be bought and sold, but a mystery to be approached with humility and reverence. Those who sought to use prophecy for their own advantage often found that the prophecy used them instead, shaping their destiny in ways they had never imagined. In the gentle twilight that falls over the sacred precinct, we can almost hear the echo of Croesus's lament, the sound of a man who learned too late that some questions are better left unasked, and that the future, once glimpsed, becomes a burden too heavy for mortal shoulders to bear. The story of Croesus was not an isolated tragedy, dear listener, but the first clear manifestation of something far more profound and disturbing. As word of the Lydian king's fate spread throughout the ancient world, a pattern began to emerge. A pattern that would eventually be recognized as the oracle's curse. It was not that the Pythia spoke falsely, but that her truths were wrapped in such ambiguity that they became instruments of destruction rather than guidance. The curse was subtle, woven into the very fabric of prophetic revelation. It seemed that the more desperately someone sought to control their fate through divine knowledge, the more likely they were to bring about the very disaster they hoped to avoid. The oracle's words became mirrors, reflecting not the future as it would be, but the future as it would be shaped by the seeker's response to the prophecy itself. Consider the tragic tale of Laius, king of Thebes, who consulted the oracle about his newborn son. The Pythia's response was unambiguous in its horror. Your son will kill you and marry your wife. Desperate to prevent this fate, Laius ordered the infant to be abandoned on Mount Cithaeron, his ankles pierced and bound. Yet this very act of abandonment set in motion the chain of events that would lead to the child's rescue, his adoption by the king of Corinth, and his eventual return to Thebes as a stranger. The baby, of course, was Oedipus, and the oracle's prophecy was fulfilled with devastating precision. The curse seemed to operate on multiple levels. At its most basic, it was a function of the oracle's deliberately ambiguous language. Her prophecies were crafted in such a way that they could be interpreted multiple ways, ensuring that no matter what actions the questioner took, the prophecy could be seen as fulfilled. But this was more than mere linguistic trickery. There was something deeper at work, something that spoke to the fundamental nature of fate and free will. The oracle's curse revealed itself most clearly in what came to be known as the self-fulfilling prophecy, a phenomenon where the very act of receiving a prophecy changed the questioner's behavior in ways that made the prophecy come true. Kings, who were warned of threats from particular directions, would take actions that created those very threats. Merchants who were told to beware of certain partnerships would behave in ways that made those partnerships dangerous. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of the curse was how it transformed the gift of foresight into a burden of anxiety. Those who had consulted the oracle successfully once would return again and again, seeking clarification of earlier prophecies or guidance for new challenges. They became addicted to divine knowledge, unable to make decisions without consulting the Pythia, their own judgment eroded by dependence on prophetic guidance. The priests of Apollo were not unaware of this phenomenon. Ancient sources suggest that there were debates within the temple about the ethical implications of their work. Some priests argued that the oracle's ambiguous responses were a form of divine wisdom, forcing questioners to think deeply about their choices and their consequences. Others worried that they were participating in a cruel game that used human desperation as entertainment for the gods. The curse seemed to affect not just individual questioners, but entire cities and nations. When Sparta consulted the oracle about their ongoing war with Athens, they received a prophecy that seemed to promise victory if they fought with all their strength. The Spartans interpreted this as divine approval for their most aggressive tactics, leading to an escalation of violence that ultimately weakened both city-states and left them vulnerable to conquest by Macedonia. The oracle's influence on the founding of colonies provided another example of how divine guidance could become a curse. Cities that established colonies without proper consultation were often successful, their colonists adapting to local conditions and building thriving communities. But those that followed the oracle's detailed instructions often found themselves bound by prophecies that prevented them from adapting to changing circumstances. The psychological impact of the curse extended beyond the original questioners to their families and descendants. Children grew up knowing they were bound by prophecies made before their birth, their life choices constrained by divine words spoken in their parents' generation. Some prophecies were said to run in families for generations, creating dynasties of doom that could never escape their preordained fate. Yet the most tragic aspect of the oracle's curse was how it affected the Pythia herself. Ancient sources speak of oracle priestesses who became increasingly disturbed by the consequences of their pronouncements. They could see the patterns emerging, could understand how their words were being twisted and misinterpreted, but they were powerless to intervene. The role of the oracle required a kind of divine neutrality that prevented her from explaining or clarifying her prophecies. Some Pythias reportedly tried to resist the curse by speaking more clearly, by offering direct guidance rather than cryptic riddles. But these attempts seemed to backfire, as straightforward prophecies often proved to be wrong, while the traditional ambiguous utterances maintained their eerie accuracy. It was as if the divine voice itself required ambiguity to function properly, as if clarity and prophetic truth were fundamentally incompatible. The burden of the oracle's role was compounded by the isolation it imposed. The Pythia lived apart from normal human society, her life consumed by her sacred function. She could not form normal relationships, could not participate in the everyday joys and sorrows of mortal life. She was respected and feared, but rarely loved. Her knowledge of the future became a barrier between herself and the present moment, making it impossible for her to live fully in either realm. As the centuries passed, the oracle's curse began to take on a life of its own. Stories circulated of questioners who had been driven mad by prophecies they couldn't understand, of kings who had abdicated their thrones rather than face the futures the oracle had revealed to them. The very power that had made Delphi the center of the ancient world began to turn against itself as people started to fear the oracle's pronouncements more than they valued her guidance. The curse manifested differently for different types of questioners. Military commanders found their strategies anticipated by enemies who had also consulted the oracle. Merchants discovered that their competitors had received similar advice, negating any advantage they might have gained. Parents who sought to protect their children from prophesied dangers often found that their protective measures were exactly what brought those dangers about. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the way the curse seemed to feed on itself. The more famous the oracle became for her accurate but destructive prophecies, the more desperate people became to consult her. They reasoned that if they could just phrase their questions correctly, if they could just interpret her responses properly, they could avoid the fate that had befallen others. But this desperation only made them more vulnerable to the curse's effects. The oracle's curse was not limited to major historical figures. Common people who consulted the Pythia often found their lives changed in ways they had never anticipated. A farmer asking about when to plant his crops might receive advice that led to a bountiful harvest, but also attracted the attention of bandits. A young woman seeking guidance about marriage might choose a husband based on the oracle's cryptic words, only to discover that her interpretation had led her to exactly the wrong choice. The curse seemed to operate according to its own dark logic. It was not random or chaotic, but followed patterns that could be perceived only in retrospect. The oracle's prophecies were always true, but their truth was often so far removed from what the questioner expected that the revelation came as a shock rather than a guidance. The divine voice spoke with perfect accuracy, but in a language that mortal minds were not equipped to fully comprehend. In the deepening shadows of evening, as the sacred precinct settles into its ancient silence, we begin to understand the true nature of the oracle's curse. It was not that the gods were cruel or deceptive, but that divine knowledge and human understanding operated according to different principles. The curse was born from the gap between these two realms, from the inevitable misunderstanding that occurred when finite minds tried to grasp infinite truth. The oracle's curse would continue to claim victims for centuries, each new tragedy adding to the growing understanding that some knowledge was too dangerous for mortals to possess, and that the future, once glimpsed, could never be unseen or unchanged. As the last echoes of ancient prophecies fade into the mountain air, let us walk together along the sacred way of Delphi, where stone and spirit have intertwined for over 2 millennia. Feel the smooth marble beneath your feet, worn by countless pilgrims who came seeking wisdom from the gods. The path winds upward through terraces carved into the mountainside, each step bringing us closer to the heart of the ancient world. Before us rises the temple of Apollo, its columns reaching toward the heavens like fingers of stone, weathered by time, yet still magnificent in their enduring grace. This is not merely a building, but a testament to human devotion, a bridge between the mortal world and the divine realm above. The temple sits perfectly positioned on the slope of Mount Parnassus, its architects having chosen this spot with careful consideration of both the sacred geography and the natural acoustics of the mountain. The temple you see today is actually the third to stand on this hallowed ground. The first was said to be built of laurel branches, a gift from the sacred grove of Tempe. The second was crafted by bees from beeswax and feathers, a structure so ethereal it seemed to float between earth and sky. But it was the third temple, built of gleaming Parian marble, It became the wonder of the ancient world, and the fragments of which still stand before us now. Imagine, if you will, the morning mist rising from the valley below as the sun's first rays strike the temple's eastern face. The 6 columns of the facade catch the light, each one a masterpiece of Doric architecture, their fluted surfaces creating patterns of light and shadow that seem to breathe with the rhythm of the mountain itself. These columns, each hewn from a single block of marble, stand 25 feet tall, their capitals crowned with simple, elegant echinus curves that speak of a time when beauty was found in proportion and restraint. The temple's foundation stones tell their own story of devotion and craftsmanship. Massive blocks of local limestone, some weighing several tons, were fitted together with such precision that not even a knife blade could slip between them. The ancient builders understood that this structure would need to withstand not only the passage of time, but the tremors of the earth itself. For Delphi sits at the intersection of geological forces that occasionally remind mortals of their place. In the cosmic order dot, as we approach the temple steps, notice how the sacred way widens into a circular courtyard, creating a natural amphitheater where pilgrims would gather before ascending to meet the Pythia. The architects of Delphi understood the psychology of sacred space, how the gradual narrowing and widening of pathways could create feelings of anticipation, reverence, and ultimate release. Each element was designed to prepare the visitors' mind for the mystical experience that awaited within. The temple's interior, though largely lost to time, once housed treasures beyond imagination. The central chamber, or naos, contained the sacred tripod where the Pythia delivered her prophecies. The walls were adorned with inscriptions of the most famous oracular responses, carved in letters of gold that caught the flickering light of sacred flames. Statues of gods and heroes stood in silent witness, their marble faces forever turned toward the spot where mortal questions met divine answers. But perhaps most intriguing was the inner sanctum, the Adyton, where the Pythia entered her trance. Here, tradition tells us, a fissure in the bedrock released vapors that helped induce the prophetic state. Modern geologists have found evidence of ethylene gas seeping through limestone fractures, lending scientific credibility to ancient accounts of sweet-scented mists that seemed to carry voices from another world. The temple's roof, now vanished, was once a marvel of engineering and artistry. Its pediments were decorated with sculptural groups depicting the eternal struggle between order and chaos, Apollo's victory over the Python that once guarded this sacred site. The acroteria, decorative elements at the roof's peaks and corners, were said to move gently in the mountain breezes, creating the illusion that the temple itself was breathing. Beyond the temple, the sacred precinct spreads across the mountainside, like a city of the gods. To the west stands the Theater of Delphi, carved into the natural slope of the mountain with such skill that it seems to emerge organically from the rock itself. This theater, with its perfect acoustics and commanding view of the valley below, could hold 5,000 spectators who came to witness the dramatic competitions of the Pythian Games. The theater's 35 rows of stone seats rise in a perfect semicircle, each tier carefully angled to provide unobstructed views of the stage below. The ancient architects understood that theater was not merely entertainment, but a form of worship, a way of exploring the relationship between gods and mortals through the medium of story and song. Here, beneath the star-filled skies of Delphi, the greatest dramatists of the ancient world premiered works that still move audiences today. The orchestra, the circular performance space at the theater's heart, was paved with polygonal stones, fitted together like a divine puzzle. At its center stood an altar to Dionysus, reminding all who performed there that their art was sacred, their words a form of prayer. The stage building, or skiing, provided a backdrop that could represent palace, temple, or the entrance to the underworld, depending on the drama being performed. As evening approaches and shadows lengthen across the sacred precinct, the treasury. Buildings along the sacred way seemed to glow with inner light. These small temple-like structures, each built by a different Greek city-state, housed precious offerings to Apollo. The treasury of the Athenians, reconstructed in modern times, gives us a glimpse of how these buildings once appeared, revered. Marble walls gleaming white against the olive-green mountainside. Each treasury was a masterpiece of architecture in miniature, designed to showcase the wealth and piety of its sponsor city. The Siphnian treasury, fragments of which survive in the site's museum, was decorated with friezes depicting the Trojan War and the battle between gods and giants. These carvings, executed with breathtaking skill, transformed architecture into narrative, making the buildings themselves into storytellers. The sacred way itself deserves contemplation as we walk its ancient stones. This processional route, which zigzags up the mountainside, was designed to create a sense of pilgrimage, of gradual ascent from the mundane world to the realm of the sacred. Bronze statues lined the path, donations from grateful cities and individuals whose prayers had been answered. The bases of these statues remain, their inscriptions still legible after more than 2 millennia. Here stood the bronze charioteer, one of the finest examples of classical sculpture ever created. There, a golden tripod commemorated a victory over the Persians. At another turn, a monument celebrated athletic triumph at the Olympic Games. The Sacred Way was thus a gallery of Greek achievement, a testament to the civilization that created democracy, philosophy, and drama. The retaining walls that support the various terraces of the sanctuary are marvels of engineering in their own right, built of polygonal masonry, with each stone cut to fit perfectly with its neighbors. These walls have withstood earthquakes that have toppled buildings throughout the Mediterranean. The ancient builders understood that flexibility, not rigidity, was the key to survival in this seismically active region. As we stand before the temple in the gathering dusk, the architecture of Delphi reveals itself as more than mere building. It is a three-dimensional prayer, a hymn in stone that has been singing for over 2,000 years. The proportions of the columns, the curve of the theater seats, the precise alignment of the treasuries, all were calculated to create harmony between human aspirations and divine order. The springs that bubble up through the rock at various points throughout the sanctuary had their own music to the symphony of stone. The Castalian spring, where pilgrims purified themselves before approaching the Oracle, still flows today, its waters carrying the same mineral taste that touched the lips of Socrates, Alexander the Great, and countless others who came seeking wisdom. In the fading light, as the last tourists depart and silence settles over the ruins, the true magic of Delphi's architecture becomes apparent. These stones, arranged with such care and precision, create a space that seems to exist outside ordinary time. Here, in this marriage of human craft and natural beauty, the ancient Greeks achieved their greatest architectural triumph, a place where the divine and mortal worlds could meet. The temple foundations, worn smooth by centuries of weather, still radiate a sense of purpose and power. The broken columns, though fallen, point toward heaven with undiminished dignity. The theater seats, empty now of spectators, seem to await a next performance, the next moment when art and spirit will unite in celebration of human potential. As night falls completely over Delphi, the marble stones seem to hold and reflect the starlight, creating an ethereal glow that transforms the ruins into something magical. The architecture of the sanctuary, designed to inspire awe and reverence, continues to fulfill its purpose. In the presence of these ancient stones, we understand why the Greeks believed this place to be the center of the world, where earth and sky, mortal and divine, past and present, all come together in eternal harmony. The sacred way grows quiet under the star-filled sky, its stones holding the memory of countless footsteps, countless prayers, countless moments of revelation. The Temple of Apollo, though roofless now, still shelters the dreams and hopes of all who seek meaning in the beautiful mystery of existence. In the gentle mountain breeze, in the whisper of spring water over stone, in the play of moonlight on marble, the sacred architecture of Delphi continues to speak to those who take the time to listen. As the marble columns of Apollo's temple catch the first light of dawn, we find ourselves transported to a time when Delphi pulsed with life beyond the whispered prophecies of the Pythia. Every fourth year, the sacred precinct transformed from a place of quiet contemplation into a festival ground where the finest minds, bodies, and spirits of the Greek world gathered to compete in honor of the god who had made this mountainside the center of civilization at the Pythian Games, second only to the Olympics in prestige and grandeur, were born from tragedy and triumph intertwined. Legend tells us that these games commemorated Apollo's victory over the great serpent Python, the primordial creature that once guarded the prophetic spring. Just as the god's arrows had pierced the darkness of chaos, so too did these competitions celebrate the human spirit's triumph over its own limitations. Picture, if you will, the transformation that would sweep across the sanctuary in the months leading up to the games. The sacred way, usually traversed by individual pilgrims seeking divine guidance, would bustle with athletes, poets, musicians, and spectators arriving from every corner of the Mediterranean world. The mountain air would ring with the sound of hammers and chisels as temporary structures were erected to house the thousands of visitors who would call Delphi home for the duration of the festival. The games began not with athletic competition, but with music, for Apollo was first and foremost the god of harmony and artistic inspiration. In the theater carved into the mountainside, the finest musicians of the Greek world would gather to compete in contests that were considered as sacred as any religious ritual. The cithara competition, featuring the lyre-like instrument most beloved by Apollo, would draw performers who had spent years perfecting their craft. Imagine sitting in those stone seats as the sun sets behind the western mountains, the theater filling with a gentle murmur of anticipation. The first competitor takes his place in the circular orchestra, his cithara gleaming in the torchlight. As his fingers touch the strings, the sound resonates not just through the theater, but seems to echo from the very rocks of Parnassus itself. The notes rise and fall like the mountain mist, each melody a prayer offered to the god of music. The judges, themselves accomplished musicians, chosen from the most respected cities of Greece, would listen with the intensity of those who understood that they were witnessing not mere entertainment, but the highest expression of human artistry. The winners would receive not gold or silver, but a crown of laurel leaves cut from the sacred grove of Tempe, the same valley where Apollo had first purified himself after slaying the Python. But music was only the beginning. The festival would continue with competitions in poetry, where the greatest literary minds of the age would present their works. Epic poets would recite portions of the Iliad and Odyssey, their voices carrying across the theater as they brought to life the heroes and gods of Greek mythology. Lyric poets would offer more intimate compositions, songs of love and loss, of triumph and tragedy, that spoke to the deepest emotions of the human heart. The rhapsode competitions were particularly beloved, featuring performers who specialized in the dramatic recitation of poetry. These artists were actors, singers, and storytellers combined, capable of holding an audience spellbound for hours as they brought ancient tales to life through the power of voice and gesture alone. In the hushed atmosphere of the theater, with only the sound of wind through the olive trees and the distant tinkle of sacred springs, these performances took on an almost mystical quality. As the musical competitions concluded, the festival would shift to athletic events that rivaled those of Olympia in their intensity and significance. The Stadium of Delphi, carved into a natural depression in the mountainside above the theater, would come alive with the sounds of competition. This elongated oval, surrounded by stone seats that could accommodate 7,000 spectators, provided the perfect venue for foot races that tested both speed and endurance. The stadium race, a sprint covering the length of the track, would see the fastest runners from across the Greek world competing for the honor of victory. But it was the Diolos, the double-length race requiring runners to sprint the full length of the stadium and back, that truly tested an athlete's mettle. The sound of bare feet pounding against packed earth would echo from the surrounding mountains, while spectators held their breath as runners pushed themselves to the very limits of human capability. The Dolichos, the long-distance race, transformed the stadium into a theater of endurance. Runners would circle the track multiple times, their breathing visible in the cool mountain air as they fought not just against their competitors, but against the rarefied atmosphere of Delphi's elevation. The crowd would cheer and encourage, understanding that they were witnessing not just athletic competition, but a form of worship, a dedication of physical excellence to the God who embodied perfection in all its forms. Wrestling competitions would follow, conducted in the same spirit of sacred athleticism. The pale dust of the wrestling ground would rise in clouds as competitors grappled with one another, their bodies glistening with olive oil and sweat. The rules were simple, but the execution required years of training and a deep understanding of leverage, timing, and psychology. Victory went not always to the strongest, but to the most skilled and mentally prepared. The pentathlon combined 5 different events, creating a competition that demanded versatility and well-rounded excellence. Discus throwing, javelin, long jump, wrestling, and running would test every aspect of an athlete's capabilities. The discus throwers would spin and release their bronze discs with a grace that seemed almost dance-like, while javelin throwers would demonstrate the deadly accuracy that had made Greek warriors feared throughout the ancient world. But perhaps the most spectacular and dangerous of all competitions was the chariot race held in the hippodrome below the sanctuary. The thunder of hooves and the creak of wooden wheels would fill the air as teams of horses pulled their chariots around the track at breakneck speed. The skill required to manage these powerful animals while navigating the tight turns at each end of the course was extraordinary, and crashes were common enough that simply finishing the race was considered an achievement. The equestrian events were particularly prestigious because they required not just personal skill, but significant wealth to maintain racing stables. The victors in these competitions were often aristocrats and tyrants who used their victories to enhance their political standing. The olive crowns they received were worth far more than their weight in gold, representing as they did the favor of Apollo and the admiration of the Greek world. Between the formal competitions, the festival would buzz with informal displays of talent and skill. Merchants would set up stalls along the sacred way, selling everything from votive offerings to athletic equipment. Food vendors would offer specialties from across the Mediterranean, creating a culinary festival that paralleled the athletic and artistic competitions. The aroma of roasted lamb, fresh bread, and honey cakes would mingle with the incense from the temple, creating an atmosphere of celebration that engaged all the senses. Philosophers and teachers would gather in the shade of the olive trees, engaging in the kind of intellectual discourse that made Greece the birthplace of Western philosophy. These impromptu symposiums would continue late into the night, with participants debating questions of ethics, politics, and the nature of existence itself. The presence of so many brilliant minds in one place created an intellectual ferment that was as much a part of the Pythian games as any formal competition. The festival would conclude with a grand procession that wound its way up the sacred way to the temple of Apollo. Winners would carry their laurel crowns with humble pride, understanding that their victories were not personal achievements, but gifts from the gods. The entire gathering would offer thanks to Apollo for the opportunity to witness and participate in this celebration of human potential. As the crowds dispersed, and the temporary structures were dismantled, Delphi would gradually return to its more familiar role as a place of oracle and prophecy. But the memory of the games would linger in the mountain air, a reminder that this sacred place was not just about seeking knowledge of the future, but about celebrating the very best of human achievement in the eternal present. The Pythian games represented the Greek ideal of Pythia, the beautiful and good, the perfect harmony of physical excellence, intellectual achievement, and moral virtue. In honoring Apollo through competition and artistry, the participants and spectators alike participated in a vision of human potential that continues to inspire us today, in the quiet that followed each festival. As the last echoes of music and competition faded into the mountain silence, Delphi would hold these memories like treasures. The stones of the theater and stadium, the sacred way, and temple foundations all bore witness to these moments when the human spirit soared highest, when art and athletics combined to create something greater than the sum of their parts. Pythian games were more than entertainment or even competition. They were a testament to the Greek belief that human beings, when they strive for excellence in all its forms, can touch the divine. In the rarefied air of Delphi, surrounded by the majesty of Parnassus and watched over by the spirit of Apollo, mortals could transcend their limitations and achieve a kind of immortality through the perfect expression of their talents. As the last echoes of the Pythian games fade into memory and the mountain returns to its eternal silence, we find ourselves drawn back to the heart of Delphi's mystery. Beyond the crowds and competitions, beyond the marble columns and sacred architecture, there existed a world within a world, a carefully maintained system of devotion and ritual that kept the flame of prophecy burning bright for over 1,000 years. At the center of this sacred ecosystem stood the Pythia, the woman chosen by Apollo to be his voice on earth. But she was not alone in her divine calling. Around her moved a constellation of priests, attendants, and guardians, each playing their part in maintaining the delicate balance between the mortal and divine realms. Let us step quietly into their world, observing with reverence the ancient rhythms that governed life at the navel of the world. The selection of a Pythia was no casual matter. She had to be a woman of impeccable character, born in Delphi itself, her roots deep in the sacred soil of Parnassus. In the earliest days of the Oracle, she was required to be a virgin, pure and untouched by the concerns of ordinary life. Later, as the Oracle's influence grew and the position became more demanding, married women of mature years were chosen, but they were required to leave their families behind and dedicate themselves entirely to Apollo's service. Picture her as she prepares for the monthly ritual of prophecy. In the pre-dawn darkness, she would bathe in the sacred waters of the Castalian spring, the cold mountain water shocking her system into heightened awareness. The ritual purification was not merely symbolic but physical, washing away the accumulated dust and concerns of ordinary life. As the water cascaded over her shoulders, she would feel herself beginning the transformation from mortal woman to divine vessel. The temple of Apollo would be prepared with equal care by the priests and attendants who served as the oracle's support system. The sacred laurel leaves, cut from trees that grew near the tomb of Neoptolemus, would be burned on the altar, their smoke carrying prayers and preparations to the god above. The tripod, that three-legged bronze seat that had become the most recognizable symbol of Delphic prophecy, would be positioned over the fissure in the temple floor, where vapors from the earth's depths would rise to meet the consciousness of the Pythia. The chief priest, known as the prophets, held a position of enormous responsibility and prestige. He was the one who would receive the Pythia's often incoherent utterances and translate them into the carefully crafted hexameter verses that would be delivered to the questioners. This was no simple task of transcription, but a complex act of interpretation that required deep knowledge of mythology, politics, and human nature. The prophets had to understand not just what the Pythia was saying, but what Apollo meant by it. Surrounding the prophets were the Hosioi, the sacred ones, 5 men chosen for life from among the most prominent families of Delphi. They oversaw the religious ceremonies, maintained the temple's sacred objects, and ensured that every ritual was performed with the precision that Apollo demanded. These men lived lives of careful devotion, their every action guided by traditions that stretched back to the mythical founding of the Oracle, the Pythioi. Another group of temple officials were responsible for the practical aspects of Oracle consultation. They would receive the petitioners, collect the required fees, and ensure that the proper sacrifices were made before anyone could approach the Pythia. The sacred way was lined with their careful preparations, from the initial purification rites to the final delivery of the oracular response. But perhaps the most fascinating of all the temple's guardians were the Thyids, the sacred women who served as the Pythia's attendants and assistants. These women, chosen for their devotion and discretion, would help prepare the Pythia for her monthly ordeal. They would dress her in the sacred robes, place the laurel crown upon her head, and guide her to the tripod when the moment of prophecy arrived. The Thyids were also responsible for maintaining the sacred fire that burned continuously in the temple's hearth. This flame, said to have been kindled by Apollo himself, could never be allowed to die. Day and night, in shifts that had continued for centuries, these women would tend the fire, adding specially prepared wood and sacred oils to keep it burning bright. The responsibility was enormous, for the extinguishing of the sacred flame would signal the end of Apollo's presence at Delphi. The daily life of these temple guardians followed rhythms as old as the oracle itself. Before dawn, they would rise and perform their ablutions, preparing themselves for another day of sacred service. The morning hours were spent in ritual cleansing of the temple, sweeping the marble floors with brooms made from sacred laurel branches, polishing the bronze vessels that held the holy water, and arranging the votive offerings that pilgrims had left during the previous day. Preparation of the Pythia on consultation days was an elaborate ceremony in itself. She would be led to a special chamber beneath the temple, where she would drink from the sacred spring and chew laurel leaves that would help induce the prophetic trance. The exact nature of this preparation was one of the temple's most closely guarded secrets passed down from generation to generation of temple attendants. The moment when the Pythia took her place on the tripod was one of profound transformation. Witnesses described how her appearance would change, her eyes taking on a distant, otherworldly quality as the sacred vapors rose around her. Her voice, normally that of an ordinary woman, would deepen and take on strange cadences, as if another consciousness was speaking through her vocal cords. The priests who attended these sessions had to be men of exceptional courage and composure. The Pythia in her prophetic state was said to be terrifying to behold, her body contorting as the god spirit moved through her, her voice echoing with supernatural power. They had to remain calm and focused, ready to catch her if she fell, ready to interpret her words, ready to protect both her and the questioners from the overwhelming force of divine possession. Between the monthly consultation days, the temple maintained a quieter but no less sacred rhythm. The priests would study the ancient texts, memorizing the traditional responses and learning the intricate protocols that governed every aspect of oracle consultation. They would also serve as the repository of the temple's vast accumulated wisdom, maintaining records of previous prophecies and their fulfillments. The Pythia herself, during her non-oracular periods, lived a life of contemplation and preparation. She would spend hours in meditation, often in the sacred grove of laurel trees that surrounded the temple. The other priestesses would join her in these quiet moments, creating a community of women dedicated to maintaining the spiritual atmosphere that made prophecy possible. The temple's scribes, another crucial group of guardians, were responsible for maintaining the written records of the oracle's pronouncements. These men, chosen for their learning and discretion, would carefully transcribe each prophecy, noting not just the words, but the circumstances of their delivery. Their archives became one of the most valuable collections of documents in the ancient world. Consulted by historians and philosophers for centuries, the sacred musicians of the temple provided another layer of spiritual support. Their lyres and flutes would sound during the preliminary ceremonies, creating an atmosphere of reverence and preparing the minds of all present for the sacred encounter to come. The music was not entertainment but prayer, each note carefully chosen to harmonize with the spiritual energies that permeated the sanctuary. The temple's treasurers, drawn from the most trustworthy families of Delphi, guarded the enormous wealth that accumulated from grateful petitioners. Gold and silver offerings, precious jewels, and works of art from across the Mediterranean world were their responsibility. But they understood that they were not merely custodians of wealth, but guardians of tokens of faith and gratitude offered to Apollo. The ritual calendar that governed temple life was complex and precise. Each month brought its own ceremonies, each season its own observances. The priests had to maintain not just the lunar calendar that determined the Pythia's consultation days, but also the solar calendar that governed the festivals and the mysterious 8-year cycle that some scholars believe was connected to the oracle's deepest mysteries. The training of new priests and attendants was a lengthy process that could take years or even decades. Young men and women chosen for service would begin as novices, learning the basics of ritual purification and sacred protocol. Gradually, they would be initiated into deeper mysteries, always under the watchful eyes of their elders who had dedicated their lives to Apollo's service. The relationships between these various groups of temple guardians were complex and carefully defined. Each had their own responsibilities, their own authority, their own sacred obligations. Yet they worked together like the parts of a great musical instrument, each contributing their unique voice to the harmony that made Delphi function as the spiritual center of the ancient world. The psychological burden carried by these guardians was enormous. They knew that the eyes of the Greek world were upon them, that kings and commoners alike depended on their faithfulness in maintaining the sacred traditions. The weight of this responsibility shaped every aspect of their lives, from their daily routines to their most intimate thoughts and dreams, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the temple lay silent except for the soft footsteps of the fire tenders and the distant sound of sacred springs. These guardians would sometimes pause in their duties to contemplate the magnitude of their calling. They were the links in a chain that stretched back to the mythical founding of the Oracle, and they understood that their faithfulness would determine whether that chain would continue unbroken into the future. The Pythia and her fellow guardians were more than servants of Apollo. They were the living embodiment of humanity's deepest longing for connection with the divine. In their careful rituals, their devoted service, and their unwavering faith, they created a space where the impossible became possible, where the voice of a god could speak through mortal lips, where the future could be glimpsed through the mists of time. The seasons turned at Delphi as they always had. The sacred springs continued their eternal flow, and the mountain winds still whispered through the olive groves. But something fundamental had begun to change in the world beyond the sanctuary walls. The great city-states that had once sent their finest athletes to compete in the Pythian games, their most pressing questions to the oracle, were growing weary with centuries of warfare and political upheaval. The age of classical Greece, that brilliant flowering of human achievement, was slowly drawing to a close dot. It began almost imperceptibly, like the gradual dimming of a lamp as its oil runs low. The pilgrims still came to Delphi, but not in the numbers they once had. The questions they brought were different too, less about matters of state and war, more about personal concerns and private anxieties. The great communal faith that had sustained the oracle for so many centuries was fragmenting into individual needs and desires. The rise of Macedonia under Philip II and his son Alexander marked the beginning of a new era for Greece. These northern rulers, while deeply respectful of Greek culture and tradition, represented a different kind of power than the democratic city-states that had created the world of classical antiquity. When Alexander consulted the oracle before his great expedition to conquer Persia, he received the famous response, "You are invincible, my son." But this would prove to be one of the last great moments of the oracle's political influence. Alexander's conquests created a vast Hellenistic world that stretched from Egypt to India. But this expansion paradoxically weakened the central importance of places like Delphi. The oracle had been most powerful when the Greek world was small and tightly connected, when every city-state knew its neighbors and shared common concerns. In the vast cosmopolitan empire that followed Alexander's death, Delphi seemed increasingly provincial, a relic of a more intimate age. The Romans, those pragmatic builders of empire, had a complex relationship with Greek religious traditions. They respected the antiquity and prestige of Delphi, and many Roman generals and politicians made the pilgrimage to consult the oracle. But they also brought with them a different worldview, one that emphasized practical action over mystical contemplation, legal precedent over divine inspiration. The Roman mind, brilliant as it was, struggled to fully embrace the ambiguous wisdom that had made Delphi so compelling to the Greeks. That picture the temple grounds during these years of transition. The marble columns still gleamed in the mountain sunlight, but there were fewer hands to maintain them. The sacred fire still burned, but the Thyades who tended it were aging, and fewer young women were choosing the austere life of temple service. The treasuries along the sacred way began to look neglected, their offerings gathering dust as the city-states that had built them turned their attention to more immediate concerns. The Pythia of this era faced challenges that her predecessors could never have imagined. The clear stream of pilgrims had become a trickle, and the questions they brought reflected the uncertainty of the times. Instead of asking whether to wage war against a neighboring city, petitioners now asked whether they should flee from barbarian invasions. Instead of seeking divine guidance for colonial expeditions, they wondered whether their traditional way of life would survive the next decade. The priests and temple guardians found themselves struggling to maintain traditions that seemed increasingly irrelevant to the changing world. The ancient rituals continued, but with a kind of desperate precision, as if perfect adherence to form could somehow restore the substance that was gradually ebbing away. The elaborate ceremonies of purification and prophecy began to feel hollow, like theatrical performances in an empty theater. Economic pressures added to the spiritual crisis. The wealth that had once flowed into Delphi from grateful cities and successful petitioners began to dry up. The temple's vast treasuries, accumulated over centuries of generous donations, were gradually depleted by the costs of maintaining the sanctuary and supporting its religious staff. The Persian Wars had already forced the temple to loan money to Greek cities, and the political chaos that followed made it difficult to collect on these debts. The rise of philosophy as a distinct intellectual discipline also challenged the oracle's traditional authority. Where once the Pythia's cryptic pronouncements had been accepted as divine wisdom, now there were schools of thought that claimed human reason could discover truth without divine intervention. The Stoics, with their emphasis on rational acceptance of fate, had little need for oracular guidance. The Epicureans, focused on achieving happiness through philosophical understanding, found the oracle's traditional concerns with politics and warfare irrelevant to their pursuits. Christianity, though still a minority religion, began to exert its influence on the religious landscape of the late Roman Empire. The early Christians saw the pagan oracles as either fraudulent or demonic, and their growing presence in the cities of the eastern Mediterranean created an atmosphere of religious competition that the oracle had never faced before. The simple, direct message of Christian salvation contrasted sharply with the complex ambiguities of traditional Greek religion. The Gothic invasions of the 3rd century CE brought physical destruction to many parts of Greece, though Delphi itself was largely spared, but the psychological impact was enormous. The sense of security and permanence that had allowed the oracle to flourish for so many centuries was shattered. People turned to more immediate forms of religious comfort, seeking gods who promised protection in this world, rather than wisdom about the next. The emperor Diocletian's great persecution of Christians in the early 4th century created a brief revival of traditional pagan religion, and Delphi experienced a temporary resurgence of interest. But this proved to be a false dawn, the last flickering of a flame that had already lost its essential fuel. The oracle's responses from this period show a defensive, almost petulant quality, as if the ancient wisdom was growing tired of being questioned and doubted. The reign of Constantine the Great marked the beginning of the end for the traditional religious world of antiquity. When the emperor converted to Christianity and began to favor the new faith with imperial patronage, the balance of religious power shifted decisively. The oracle's political influence, already weakened by centuries of imperial rule, now faced an additional challenge from a state that was increasingly committed to Christian orthodoxy. The temple staff during these final centuries showed remarkable dedication to their calling, maintaining the ancient rituals even as the world around them changed beyond recognition. The Pythia continued to deliver prophecies, though to ever smaller audiences. The sacred fire was kept burning, though the hands that tended it were growing old, and there were fewer young people willing to take up the sacred calling. Julian the Apostate, the last pagan emperor, made a desperate attempt to restore the old religion during his brief reign in the 360s CE. He consulted the oracle at Delphi, but the response he received was tragically prophetic of the fate that awaited the ancient faith. "Tell the king that the carved hall has fallen to the ground," the Pythia intoned. "Phoebus no longer has his house, nor his mantic laurel, nor his prophetic spring. The speaking water has been quenched." This final oracle, if it was indeed delivered as recorded, represents one of the most poignant moments in the history of Delphi. The voice that had guided Greece through its greatest triumphs and darkest hours was now announcing its own silence. The god who had spoken through the sacred vapors for over 1,000 years was withdrawing from the world, leaving only the echo of his former presence. The last recorded consultation of the oracle occurred sometime in the late 4th century CE, though the exact date is lost to history. By this time, the Christian emperor Theodosius had banned pagan sacrifice and ordered the closing of pagan temples throughout the empire. The sacred way, once crowded with pilgrims and offering bearers, fell silent except for the sound of wind through the abandoned buildings. The priests and temple guardians who had dedicated their lives to Apollo's service found themselves in an impossible position. Their world had not ended suddenly, through conquest or natural disaster, but had simply faded away like a conversation that gradually grows quieter until it finally stops. Some may have converted to Christianity, attempting to find in the new faith some echo of the spiritual certainties they had lost. Others may have withdrawn to private life, carrying with them the secret knowledge of rituals that would never again be performed at the physical decay of the sanctuary, proceeded slowly but inexorably. Without the constant flow of pilgrims and their offerings, there was no money to maintain the marble columns and bronze statues. The roof tiles began to fall, exposing the temple's interior to the mountain weather. Weeds grew between the stones of the sacred way, and the carefully maintained terraces began to erode. Yet even in its abandonment, Delphi retained a kind of haunting beauty. The mountain setting remained as magnificent as ever. The olive groves continued to shimmer silver in the Aegean light, and the sacred springs still bubbled up through the ancient rocks. Travelers of the Byzantine period would occasionally visit the ruins, marveling at the remnants of a civilization that had achieved such heights of artistic and spiritual expression. The local people, many of whom could trace their ancestry back to the ancient temple servants, preserved fragments of the old traditions in their folk customs and local festivals. They told stories of the Oracle and the Prophecies, though these tales became increasingly garbled and mythologized as the centuries passed. The sacred springs were still regarded with a kind of reverence, though now they were associated with Christian saints rather than Apollodot in the growing darkness of the medieval period, when much of the learning of antiquity was being lost or forgotten. The memory of Delphi persisted as a symbol of a lost golden age. Byzantine scholars preserved some of the ancient texts that described the oracle, and these manuscripts would eventually find their way to the libraries of Renaissance Italy, where they would inspire a new generation of scholars and artists. Silence that settled over Delphi was not the silence of death, but of waiting. The stones of the temple, though scattered and broken, still held within them the memory of the voices that had once filled the sacred space. The mountain slopes, though no longer echoing with the sound of pilgrims' footsteps, retained the invisible pathways worn by centuries of seekers. The oracle had spoken its last prophecy, but the human longing for divine guidance that had created and sustained it remained as strong as ever. For more than 1,000 years, the sacred precinct of Delphi lay buried beneath the accumulated earth of centuries, like a sleeping giant covered by the gentle blanket of time. The olive trees grew tall above the fallen columns, their roots intertwining with ancient marble. Shepherds grazed their flocks where once the Pythia had delivered her prophecies, and the mountain winds carried no memory of the voices that had once filled these sacred spaces with wonder and reverence. The village of Castri had grown up over the ruins, its modest houses built with stones that had once formed the walls of treasuries and temples. The villagers lived their simple lives unaware that beneath their feet lay one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. They had inherited fragments of ancient stories, half-remembered tales of a time when their mountain was the center of the world. But these seemed as distant and mythical as the stories of the gods themselves did. It was not until the Renaissance that European scholars began to seriously study the ancient texts that described Delphi's former glory. In the libraries of Venice and Florence, learned men pored over the writings of Plutarch, Pausanias, and other ancient authors who had left detailed descriptions of the sanctuary. These scholars, fired by the humanistic enthusiasm of their age, began to dream of seeing with their own eyes the places where Socrates had walked and Alexander had received his famous prophecy. The first serious attempt to locate the ancient site came in the late 15th century, when a group of Italian scholars made the arduous journey to Greece. They found the village of Castri perched on the slopes of Parnassus, and local tradition still pointed to certain springs and rock formations as having some connection with the ancient oracle. But the actual remains of the sanctuary were so thoroughly buried that these early visitors could only speculate about their exact location. The 18th century brought a new wave of interest in classical antiquity, driven by the archaeological discoveries at Pompeii and Herculaneum. European travelers began to make regular pilgrimages to Greece, seeking to understand the physical reality behind the literary descriptions they had studied. The British Society of Dilettanti sponsored several expeditions to Greece, and their published accounts began to create a more accurate picture of the country's archaeological riches. Byron's romantic poetry about Greece captured the imagination of educated Europeans, and his tragic death in the Greek War of Independence made him a martyr to the cause of Hellenic revival. The struggle for Greek independence in the 1820s focused international attention on the country, and as the new Greek state began to take shape, there was growing interest in uncovering and preserving the monuments of its glorious past. The German archaeologist Ernst Curtius conducted some of the earliest scientific excavations in Greece, and his work at Olympia demonstrated the potential rewards of systematic archaeological investigation. His success inspired other scholars to look for similar opportunities, and Delphi, with its rich literary associations and tantalizing hints of buried treasures, became an obvious target for excavation. The major breakthrough came in the 1880s, when the French government negotiated with Greece for the exclusive right to excavate at Delphi. This was not merely an academic arrangement, but a complex diplomatic and financial undertaking. The villagers of Castri would have to be relocated, their homes and livelihoods compensated, and an entirely new village built for them on a nearby site. The French government, recognizing the historical importance of the project, committed enormous resources to making it possible. The French Archaeological School at Athens, under the direction of Théophile Hameau, took charge of the excavation. The scale of the undertaking was unprecedented in the history of archaeology. The entire village of Castri, with its narrow streets and traditional stone houses, had to be carefully dismantled and moved. The villagers, many of whom had lived there for generations, watched with a mixture of sadness and excitement as their old homes were taken down stone by stone. The excavation began in earnest in 1892, and from the very first day, the archaeologists knew they had made a discovery of extraordinary importance. As the accumulated earth and debris of centuries was carefully removed, the outlines of the ancient sanctuary began to emerge like a photograph developing in a darkroom. The sacred way, that processional route that had carried pilgrims from the entrance to the temple, was the first major feature to be uncovered. Picture the excitement of those first excavators as they uncovered the foundations of the treasuries, each one identified by inscriptions that had survived the centuries. The treasury of the Athenians, the treasury of the Siphonians, the treasury of the Thebans. These buildings, known from ancient descriptions, suddenly materialized from the earth like the fulfillment of a dream. The archaeologists found themselves walking in the footsteps of Herodotus and Plutarch, seeing with their own eyes the monuments that the ancient authors had described. The discovery of the theater was particularly thrilling. As the excavators cleared away the accumulated soil, the perfect semicircle of stone seats emerged, tier by tier, until the entire structure stood revealed. The acoustics were still perfect, and the excavators delighted in testing them, speaking from the orchestra and listening to their voices carry clearly to the highest seats. It was as if the theater had been waiting all these centuries for its audience to return. The Temple of Apollo proved more challenging to excavate, as it had been more thoroughly destroyed by earthquakes and stone robbers over the centuries. But even its scattered remains told a powerful story. The massive foundations revealed the temple's original proportions, and fragments of columns and architectural decoration allowed the archaeologists to reconstruct its appearance. Most exciting of all was the discovery of the Adyton, the inner sanctum where the Pythia had delivered her prophecies. The excavation of the stadium, carved into the hillside above the theater, revealed another perfectly preserved ancient structure. The starting line for the foot races was still clearly marked, and the stone seats retained their original elegance. Standing in the stadium, the archaeologists could almost hear the cheers of ancient spectators and the pounding of runners' feet on the track. But it was the discovery of the artistic treasures that truly captured the world's imagination. The excavators found hundreds of sculptures, from massive cult statues to delicate votive offerings. The bronze charioteer, that masterpiece of classical sculpture, was found in fragments scattered across the sanctuary. When the pieces were carefully reassembled, the result was a work of art that took the breath away, a figure so lifelike that it seemed ready to step down from its pedestal and drive his bronze horses once more. The Sphinx of Naxos, perched on its tall column, was another remarkable discovery. This mysterious creature, with its human head and bird's body, had once gazed out over the sanctuary from its lofty perch. The archaeologists found it broken into pieces, but when reconstructed, it retained all of its ancient enigmatic power. The quality of the carving was so fine that individual feathers could be distinguished on the creature's wings. The inscriptions discovered during the excavation provided a wealth of information about the daily life of the ancient sanctuary. Records of temple accounts, lists of sacred officials, and copies of important oracular responses were found carved on stone tablets and marble slabs. These texts brought the ancient world to life in ways that no literary source could match, providing intimate details about the practical workings of the oracle and the people who served it. The French excavators worked with meticulous care, recording the exact position of every find and preserving even the smallest fragments for study. This scientific approach was revolutionary for its time, when many archaeological expeditions were little more than treasure hunts. The detailed records they kept have proved invaluable to later scholars, allowing them to reconstruct not just the appearance of the sanctuary, but the complex relationships between its various buildings and spaces at the creation of the Delphi Museum. To house the finds was another milestone in the history of archaeology. This was one of the first museums designed specifically to display objects in their original context, with galleries arranged to help visitors understand the sanctuary as it had actually functioned. The museum's collection includes some of the finest examples of ancient Greek art ever discovered, from the Archaic period through the Roman era. The international attention focused on the Delphi. Excavations helped to establish archaeology as a serious academic discipline. Scholars from around the world came to study the finds, and the publication of the excavation reports set new standards for archaeological documentation. The work at Delphi demonstrated that archaeological investigation could contribute as much to our understanding of the ancient world as the study of literary texts. The impact of the discoveries extended far beyond the academic world. Artists and writers were inspired by the beauty of the sculptures and the romance of the setting. The charioteer became one of the most recognized works of ancient art, reproduced in countless books and exhibitions. The very name Delphi became synonymous with mystery and ancient wisdom, capturing the popular imagination in ways that few archaeological sites have managed to achieve. The work of excavation and restoration has continued for more than a century, with each generation of archaeologists adding to our understanding of the site. Modern techniques have revealed details that the original excavators could never have imagined. Ground-penetrating radar has located buried structures without the need for destructive digging. Chemical analysis of pottery and metal objects has revealed information about ancient trade routes and manufacturing techniques. The conservation of the site has become as important as its excavation. The marble sculptures and architectural fragments, exposed to the elements after centuries of burial, face new challenges from air pollution and tourism. Specialists work constantly to preserve these treasures for future generations, using techniques that would have seemed magical to the original excavators. Today, as visitors walk the sacred way and climb the steps to the temple platform, they follow a path that has been carefully restored based on the archaeological evidence. The stones beneath their feet are the same stones that supported the footsteps of ancient pilgrims, and the views they see are essentially unchanged from those that greeted visitors 2,000 years ago. The oracle may be silent, but the site continues to inspire a sense of wonder and reverence that transcends the boundaries of time and culture. The resurrection of Delphi from its long burial has been one of archaeology's greatest triumphs. A site that had been lost for over a millennium now stands revealed as one of the most important and beautiful archaeological sites in the world. The careful work of generations of archaeologists has given us back not just a collection of ancient buildings, but a window into the spiritual and cultural life of one of humanity's greatest civilizations. As our long journey through the sacred stones of Delphi draws to its gentle close, we find ourselves standing once more at the edge of time itself. The ancient world has shared its secrets with us tonight, and now the moon rises high above Mount Parnassus, casting silver light across the ruins that have witnessed so much human longing, so much divine mystery. The tourists have long departed. The archaeologists have packed away their tools. The scholars have closed their books and returned to their modern lives. But here, in the quietude of the Greek night, something eternal remains. Something that transcends the rise and fall of empires, the changing of religions, the march of centuries. Listen carefully now, as the wind moves through the ancient olive trees. Can you hear it? That soft susurration that might be nothing more than air passing through leaves, or might be something far more profound. The shepherds who still graze their flocks on these hills speak of voices in the wind, voices that seem to come from the very stones themselves. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps the oracle never truly fell silent. The sacred spring still bubbles up from deep within the earth, just as it did when Pythia first descended into her trance-like state. Fissure in the rock, from which the ancients believed divine vapors rose, still exhales its mysterious breath. The Omphalos stone, that sacred marker of the world's center, may be housed now in a museum, but its spiritual significance remains undiminished. Scientists today tell us that the euphoric gases that once inspired the oracle's visions were likely ethylene and other natural compounds seeping from the limestone below. They explain the geological processes, the chemical reactions, the perfectly rational reasons why a person might experience altered states of consciousness in this particular place. And yet, knowledge of the mechanism does not diminish the wonder of the experience itself. For what is prophecy, really, but the human soul's deep intuition about the patterns that govern our lives? What is divine inspiration but our capacity to see beyond the immediate moment, to sense the vast interconnectedness of all things? The Oracle of Delphi was not merely a woman breathing strange gases and speaking riddles. She was a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds, a translator of the ineffable mysteries that surround us always. As you rest here tonight, allow yourself to feel that same connection. You are part of an unbroken chain of human consciousness that stretches back to those first pilgrims who climbed the sacred way to Delphi. You carry within you the same capacity for wonder, the same yearning for meaning, the same ability to perceive the numinous in the seemingly ordinary world around you. The questions that drove kings and commoners alike to seek the oracle's counsel are the same questions that move through your own heart. What does the future hold? How should I live? What is my purpose? Where will I find wisdom? These are not merely ancient concerns. They are the eternal human questions that connect us across the millennia. And perhaps, if you listen deeply enough, you might hear the whispered answers that have always been there, waiting for us to become still enough to receive them. The marble columns that once gleamed in the Mediterranean sun now stand as weathered sentinels, but their beauty is not diminished by time. If anything, they have gained a deeper poetry, a more profound eloquence. They speak not of human ambition and architectural grandeur, but of endurance, of the way beauty persists even as empires crumble, the theater where poets once competed. For laurel crowns echoes now, only with the sound of wind and the occasional call of a bird. Yet in that silence, there is music more moving than any ancient lyre. It is the music of deep time, of geological ages, of the slow breathing of the earth itself. Walk with me now, in your imagination, through the ruins one last time. Feel the smooth stones beneath your feet, worn by countless pilgrims who came here seeking answers. Touch the broken columns that once supported the roof of Apollo's temple. Stand where the sacred fire once burned, where the oracle once spoke, where the fate of nations was once decided by cryptic utterances that only the desperate and the wise truly understood, but do not mourn for what has been lost. Instead, Celebrate what has been preserved. The questions remain. The mystery endures. The human capacity for transcendence burns as brightly now as it did in the days when Pythia sat upon her sacred tripod. You are, each of you, an oracle in your own right. You carry within you the same divine spark that once animated the priestess of Apollo. You have access to the same deep wells of intuition, the same capacity to perceive patterns and possibilities that others might miss. The difference is not in the gift itself, but in your willingness to trust it, to honor it, to allow it to guide you. As the night deepens around the ancient stones, as the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, remember that you are part of something far greater than yourself. You are connected to every seeker who has ever asked the great questions, to every soul who has ever stood at the threshold between the known and unknown, hoping for guidance, praying for wisdom. The Oracle of Delphi was never really about predicting the future. It was about helping people understand the present more deeply, about encouraging them to look beyond the surface of things, to trust in the deeper patterns that govern existence. It was about reminding them that they were part of the sacred cosmos, not merely isolated individuals struggling alone against an indifferent universe. And so, as you prepare to drift into sleep, carry with you this ancient blessing: know thyself. These two words, inscribed at the entrance to Apollo's temple, contain within them all the wisdom you will ever need. Not know your neighbor, not know your enemy, not know your circumstances, but know yourself. For in that knowing lies the key to all other knowledge. The whispers of Delphi have not ceased. They simply speak now in a different language, through different voices, in different places. They speak through the quiet voice of conscience, through the sudden insight that comes unbidden, through the dream that reveals unexpected truth, through the chance encounter that changes everything. They speak through the beauty of a sunset that stops you in your tracks, through the kindness of a stranger that restores your faith, through the book that falls open to exactly the page you needed to read, through the conversation that provides the answer you didn't know you were seeking. The oracle lives on in every moment. When you pause to listen to the deeper currents of your own life, when you trust your intuition over your fear, when you choose wisdom over mere cleverness, when you remember that you are part of something infinitely larger and more mysterious than your individual concerns. As the ancient stones of Delphi rest in their eternal silence, as the sacred spring continues its timeless flow, as the wind carries its whispered secrets through the ruins, may you find the peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you need to be. The questions that brought you here tonight will find their answers in their own time, in their own way, through their own mysterious channels. Trust in the process. Trust in the mystery. Trust in the ancient wisdom that flows through you like an underground river, connecting you to all who have sought, all who have wondered, all who have dared to ask the great questions. The oracle's curse was never really a curse at all. It was a blessing disguised as a challenge, an invitation to look deeper, to trust more, to remain open to the possibility that the universe is far more responsive to our deepest needs than we usually dare to believe. Sleep now, gentle traveler. Sleep with the knowledge that you carry within you all the oracles you will ever need. Sleep with the understanding that every dawn brings new possibilities for wisdom, for insight, for the kind of knowing that transforms not just understanding, but being itself. The whispers of Delphi continue in the rhythm of your own breathing, in the beating of your own heart, in the dreams that will soon carry you into realms where all questions find their answers, where all seeking finds its rest, where all wondering dissolves into the perfect peace of simply being. And in that peace, may you find the deepest truth of all, that you are not separate from the mystery you seek. You are the mystery, seeking to know itself. You are the oracle, waiting to be consulted. You are the sacred spring, flowing with ancient wisdom. You are the temple, housing the divine. Rest now in this knowing. Rest in the eternal whisper that speaks your name with infinite tenderness. Rest in the love that has guided every true seeker. From the very beginning of time, the Oracle of Delphi smiles, and is silent, and is eternal.